They walked this earth long before the first city rose, before the first word was etched into stone. The Neanderthals, our ancient cousins and perhaps, in many ways, our forgotten selves. For decades, they've been cast as crude and beastly, dragging clubs through ice and mud. But what if we got it wrong? What if they weren't nature's failed experiment, but nature's most resilient answer to survival? Beneath the bones in caves, a different story emerges. A story of intelligence, of endurance, of families huddled together beneath mammoth skies, of minds capable of art, memory, maybe even longing. This documentary isn't just about fossils. It's about legacy. It's about the shadow of a people who shaped us more than we know and still whisper through our DNA today. Before we begin, type Neanderthals in the comments if you're ready to step into the ancient cold, into the fire-lit past, into the truth we were never told. Welcome to Prehistoric Shadows. Some 400,000 years ago, long before written language, agriculture, or even Homo sapiens, a new kind of human emerged from the ancient soils of Europe. Their world was one of raw, unforgiving cold, a place where survival wasn't just difficult, it was relentless. Glaciers moved like slow titans across the land. Seasons were brutal. Food was scarce. And yet, something remarkable happened. A species evolved not just to endure these conditions, but to master them. They were the Neanderthals, Homo Neanderthalensis, not a failed experiment in human evolution, as once thought, but a powerful and sophisticated branch of our shared family tree. Born from an earlier ancestor, Homo heidelbergensis, the Neanderthals were shaped by the Ice Age itself. While other hominins wandered more temperate zones, the Neanderthals carved out a life in a land of stone, snow, and silence. Their bodies were built like natural survival machines. Broad chests, powerful limbs, shorter statures, and large nasal passages that warmed the freezing air before it reached their lungs. These weren't random mutations. They were elegant solutions written over millennia into the Neanderthal genome by nature's harshest hand. And yet, strength alone wasn't enough. To survive in the cold meant something deeper. It meant community. The Neanderthals didn't live alone in caves. They lived in groups, in tribes, in family clusters that shared tasks, protected each other, and built a rhythm of life centered on cooperation. There was no room for ego in the Ice Age. Every hand, young or old, mattered. Their success was not just biological, it was cultural. For centuries, scientists saw them as inferior to Homo sapiens. Brutish, they said, primitive. But now, with every new fossil, every new site uncovered, that old picture is crumbling. What's replacing it is something much more human and much more astonishing. From the valleys of Spain to the steppes of Siberia, archaeologists are uncovering traces of an ancient presence bones hardened by time, tools shaped by clever hands, hearths blackened with soot. Each find is a fragment of the Neanderthal story. And piece by piece, a picture emerges of a species that not only adapted to the Ice Age, but may have defined it. They lived in the shadow of giant mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and frigid winds that could strip flesh from bone. But it was the Neanderthals who endured. For nearly 300,000 years, they walked the tundra, raised children, buried their dead, and built a life on the edge of the impossible. And that's something modern man has perhaps overlooked. They didn't merely survive, they flourished in a world that would bring most of us to our knees. We owe them more than we think. Their DNA still whispers within us in our bones, our skin, our immune systems. But more than that, Their story calls us to humility, to wonder, to listen more closely to the ancient winds that still carry their name. Because before we came to be, they were already there. They didn't have blueprints, diagrams, or formal instruction. And yet, the Neanderthals built a world of tools from nothing but earth, stone, and instinct. To many, a sharpened rock may seem crude, but in the Ice Age, it was the difference between life and death, between feeding a family and going hungry, between surviving the winter or becoming part of it. Neanderthals were craftsmen, and not in the primitive sense that once filled our textbooks. They were skilled artisans of survival, forging blades, scrapers, and points with startling sophistication. Their workshop was the wild. Their raw material? Flint, quartzite, bone, and fire. Archaeological discoveries across Europe and Western Asia reveal a striking consistency in Neanderthal toolmaking. They mastered what scientists call the Levallois technique, a method of shaping a coarse stone into a precise form so that sharp flakes could be removed with controlled strikes. This was not guesswork. It was planning. It required the mind to visualize a final product and reverse engineer the steps needed to create it. It was, in essence, prehistoric engineering. But they didn't stop there. Evidence shows that Neanderthals selected their raw materials deliberately, even traveling long distances to acquire high-quality flint or obsidian. They understood that not all stone was created equal. They experimented with shapes, angles, and pressure points. Some tools were simple scrapers for cleaning hides. Others were elegant spear tips designed to pierce thick mammoth hide or crack through bone. The tools themselves became an extension of the body part of a language passed from one generation to the next, wordlessly, but with deep understanding. And then there was fire. Making fire in the Ice Age wasn't just about warmth. It was about life itself. Neanderthals knew how to harness flame, not just find it. They likely used manganese dioxide, a mineral found in their campsites, to lower the ignition point of wood, enabling easier fire starting. That kind of innovation doesn't come from trial and error alone. It comes from knowledge, from memory, from the careful teaching of elders to the young. Their technology extended beyond tools and fire. They built shelters, constructed hearths, and may have even crafted early adhesives by distilling birch pitch, a complex process requiring temperatures over 300 degrees Celsius and an understanding of airflow, timing, and containment. In short, they were tinkerers, thinkers, and problem solvers. So why were they misunderstood for so long? Because their genius left no monuments, no temples or pyramids, just flakes of stone, blackened hearths, and bones buried under earth. But now, with modern science, those small remnants speak volumes. They speak of a people who didn't merely survive the harshest epoch in human memory. They adapted to it with intelligence. They taught, they learned, they improved. They passed down not just tools, but techniques, traditions, perhaps even pride. In the chipped edge of a flint blade, we see not just function but legacy. A glimpse into a mind that could solve problems, adapt to extremes, and shape its world with purpose. For centuries, we mistook Neanderthal tools as primitive because we misunderstood the hands that made them. But now we see clearly. These were not brutes cracking rocks. These were engineers of the ancient wild, the first great technologists of the human story. To understand the Neanderthals, we must first understand their world. And their world was ice. The Pleistocene epoch was not a gentle place. It was an age ruled by glaciers towering, grinding walls of ice that reshaped continents and swallowed valleys whole. Winters stretched not for months, but for years. Blizzards howled like wolves. The sun was a stranger, and warmth a luxury. In this stark and merciless world, there was no margin for error. A single injury, a failed hunt, or an early frost could mean death. And yet, the Neanderthals not only endured, they thrived. How? They mastered the art of adaptation. Their physical features were no accident of evolution. Stocky limbs and thick torsos conserved precious body heat. Broad noses warmed the air before it reached their lungs. Heavy brow ridges shielded their eyes from snow glare and biting winds. But anatomy was only the beginning. True survival in the Ice Age demanded more than strong bodies. It demanded unity. And this is where the Neanderthals excelled. They were not solitary hunters wandering bleak wasteland. They lived in family bands, tight-knit, interdependent, and fiercely loyal. They moved together, ate together, suffered together. They shared fire, food, and memory. Their campsites tell us this. At places like La Farassy in France or Shanidar in Iraq, we find evidence of communal hearths, fire pits surrounded by stone tools, butchered bones, and the remains of shared meals. These were not random gatherings. They were homes. Cooperation was not optional. It was law. Whether hunting mammoth or sheltering from a snowstorm, survival required trust and timing. The young learned from the old. The strong protected the weak. And when one fell ill, the other stayed not out of obligation, but perhaps out of something deeper, love. This harsh environment didn't just shape their bodies, it shaped their souls. In the cold, we see warmth. In struggle, we see solidarity. And in the stillness of an Ice Age night, we see families huddled close, telling stories in silence, bound not by blood alone, but by experience. And perhaps this is what modern science has so often overlooked, that in the bleakest era in human history, Neanderthals built something lasting. Not cities, not monuments, but bonds, unbreakable, ancestral bonds. They hunted the giants of their age reindeer, aurochs, woolly rhinoceros with weapons carved by hand and plans whispered by firelight. They followed the herds across frozen plains, knowing the land like a second skin. They moved with the rhythm of the earth itself, harsh, unpredictable, but never without purpose. We once called them primitive. But what is more advanced? The construction of tools or the construction of trust? The building of monuments or the building of community? The Neanderthals teach us that true civilization begins not with brick and mortar, but with care, with shared burdens, shared meals, and shared grief. In their world, to survive meant to belong. And in that frozen silence, beneath the weight of sky and snow, they built something that even time could not erase. They built each other. When we think of prehistory, we often imagine survival stripped to its barest terms: eat, hunt, fight, survive. But the story of the Neanderthals tells us something far more human and far more humbling. Because long before cities rose, long before religion was written down or ritual was codified, Neanderthals were practicing something sacred. They were taking care of one another. In the caves of Shanidar, nestled in the rugged mountains of northern Iraq, archaeologists uncovered a remarkable grave. A Neanderthal male, his body carefully laid in a shallow pit, surrounded by pollen from wildflowers, yarrow, hollyhock, thistle. These weren't scattered by chance. They were placed there deliberately, thoughtfully. An ancient act of farewell, A Neanderthal funeral. This wasn't an isolated case. Across Europe and Asia, we find similar signs, individuals buried with stone tools, with animal bones, with ochre, and sometimes even with their limbs arranged. These burials speak not of instinct, but of intention, of love, of memory. Who were they mourning? A mother? A child? A friend lost to the hunt or the winter cold? We may never know. But we do know this. They didn't discard their dead like broken tools. They buried them. They grieved them. Even more astonishing are the skeletons of Neanderthals who lived long after suffering terrible injuries. One man had lost the use of an arm, had been blinded in one eye, and suffered damage to his leg, yet he lived many years after. Another had advanced arthritis and limited mobility, yet he too lived on. These individuals could not have hunted or defended themselves. They were fed, sheltered, protected. They were not abandoned. Why? Because Neanderthal life was not ruled by brutality. It was rooted in bond. Their family units were small but strong parents, siblings, grandparents, sometimes unrelated individuals who became kin through shared fire and shared fate. They raised children, not alone, but together. They taught, tended wounds, and watched over one another in the dark of the Ice Age nights. They passed down knowledge, not just how to make a spear, but how to be human. And this is where science begins to give way to something deeper, the recognition that emotion, care, and even empathy are not modern inventions. They are ancient. They are primal. They are Neanderthal. For decades, we cast them as grunting brutes, incapable of higher thought or deeper feeling. But the archaeological record tells another story, one of compassion, community, and continuity. A story of hands that reached out to lift, not just to strike. Of eyes that recognized not only danger, but pain and responded. It forces us to ask, what does it mean to be civilized? Is it cities and symbols? Or is it something older, the simple, sacred act of sitting beside the dying and staying? The Neanderthals may have vanished from the earth, but they left something behind. Not just DNA, but a blueprint. A reminder that long before we were modern, we were already human. In their grief, in their kindness, in their memory, they show us the very roots of what it means to belong. And in that, they are not a separate branch on the evolutionary tree. They are part of us. For decades, we've judged intelligence by narrow metrics, the ability to write, to build cities, to invent machines. By those standards, Neanderthals fell short. But step into the shadows of their world, and a different kind of brilliance emerges, one not written in books, but etched in stone and memory. The Neanderthal brain was not only comparable in size to ours, in some ways, it was larger, particularly in regions associated with visual processing, motor control, and spatial awareness. But it's not the size that matters. It's what they did with it. To survive the Ice Age required more than brute strength. It demanded foresight, planning, empathy, and adaptation. It demanded imagination. And the Neanderthals had it. In the recesses of European caves, El Castillo in Spain, La Pasiega, Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar, we find traces of something astounding. Red ochre markings arranged in deliberate patterns, engraved zigzags on cave walls, stalagmites arranged into ring formations deep in pitch-black caverns, far from sunlight, far from mere utility. And then there are the handprints, some painted in red, others in black silhouettes left by blowing pigment over an outstretched palm. A gesture so human, it transcends time. A signature, perhaps. Or maybe something more, a declaration. I was here. I existed. These were not random acts. They were symbolic. They were art. And art requires a mind that sees beyond the present moment. A mind that reflects, that expresses, that feels. We once believed Neanderthals lacked language, that they grunted and gestured without grammar or nuance. But growing evidence suggests otherwise. Their vocal tracts were nearly identical to ours. They possessed the FOXP2 gene associated with speech and language processing in modern humans. They lived in social groups that required coordination, instruction, storytelling. What words did they speak around the fire? Did they sing? Did they name their children? Did they whisper to their dead? We may never know their exact tongue, but we are beginning to understand their voice. Their intelligence was not abstract in the way we measure it today. It was grounded, practical, emotional, intuitive. It was the kind of intelligence that feels the seasons shifting in the wind. That reads the trail of an animal across snow. That remembers which berries heal and which ones harm. That knows, without being taught, how to hold a newborn in a frozen world. This was not a species operating on instinct alone. It was a species thinking, remembering, adapting, and perhaps even dreaming. The tragedy is not that Neanderthals were less than us. The tragedy is that for centuries, we refused to see how much they truly were. In their minds burned a fire as ancient as ours, flickering in the darkness of forgotten caves, illuminating not only survival, but understanding. A different kind of intelligence. Older, wilder, but no less profound. And as we uncover the stories they left behind in pigment, in bone, in silence, we realize that the more we learn about them, the more we learn about ourselves. To imagine the world of the Neanderthals, you must strip away the modern. No cities, no steel, no roads, no borders, no hum of machines. Only wind, only silence, only the raw, unshaped earth beneath your feet. This was the Pleistocene, a time when the planet groaned under the weight of vast ice sheets, some stretching thousands of miles. Towering glaciers carved valleys and moved mountains. Forests retreated, tundra expanded. Seasons were cruel. A warm day could mean survival. A cold snap could mean extinction. And in the midst of it all, lived the Neanderthals. They didn't merely pass through this world of frost and danger. They belonged to it. They understood it. They mastered it. From the wind-swept plains of what is now northern France to the snow-covered caves of Siberia, Neanderthals occupied a range so vast and varied it rivals that of any early human species. But this was no accident. Their expansion was built on adaptation, physical, behavioral, and cultural. They hunted the great beasts of their age, mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant elk, steppe bison. These were not animals taken down with chance and brute force. They were hunted with strategy, with group coordination, and with tools crafted for precision. Some sites reveal evidence of coordinated drives, Neanderthals herding prey into natural traps or over cliffs. Others show signs of butchery that suggest knowledge of anatomy and food preservation. But they didn't rely on game alone. They gathered edible plants, nuts, and tubers. They followed seasonal patterns, moving with the migration of prey and the blooming of food sources. They knew which caves held warmth, which rivers froze first, which mountain passes opened last, and when the cold cut too deep, they sheltered. Archaeological findings show that Neanderthals built windbreaks from mammoth bones, wood, and hides. They used natural rock overhangs and caves not just as places of rest, but as homes. Within those caves, hearths burned, tools were made, stories, perhaps, were told. These spaces weren't just shelters from the cold, they were sanctuaries of culture. Their footprints are still found in cave floors, pressed into ancient mud that hardened with time. Children's prints beside adults, kneeling marks near fires, signs of life frozen in stone. Even their tools show the mark of their environment. They selected flint not only for its sharpness, but for its resistance to fracturing in cold weather. They likely cached resources in strategic spots, meat, stone, bone planning for hard times ahead. To modernize, the Neanderthal world seems harsh, even alien. But to them, it was familiar, a land they understood, not just through instinct, but through generations of learning, trial, and deep observation. They were not separate from nature. They were woven into its fabric. They did not conquer the wild. They coexisted with it, molded by its rhythms, in tune with its demands. And that's what sets them apart. We think of ourselves as the apex of adaptability, and yet, how many of us could survive 1 week in their world, let alone 300,000 years? The Neanderthal environment shaped every part of their being. Their tools, their rituals, their bodies, and their minds. And in return, the Neanderthals shaped the land itself, leaving behind not ruins, but presence. A fire pit in a cave, a scatter of bones on a windswept steppe, a footprint beside an ancient hearth. These are not just remnants of life. They are echoes, testaments to a people who did not merely survive the Ice Age, they made it their home. In the Ice Age, injury was not an inconvenience, it was a sentence. A shattered leg could mean starvation. A deep cut could become a fatal infection. There were no doctors, no hospitals, no antiseptics, only cold winds, sharp stones, and a race against time. And yet, time and again, the bones tell us the Neanderthals endured. More than that, they healed. Fossilized remains across Europe and Asia show something remarkable. Neanderthals who suffered crushed limbs, broken ribs, and even skull trauma lived on for years after their injuries. They didn't just survive by luck. They survived because someone stayed. Someone cleaned the wound. Someone brought food. Someone gave warmth when fever struck, and protection when mobility failed. And this someone wasn't just a helper, they were part of something greater, a system of care, an early form of medicine, an ancient expression of empathy. Consider Shanidar, a Neanderthal male who lived around 45,000 years ago. His skeleton shows a crushed orbit, possibly blinding one eye, a withered right arm from an old fracture, and severe hearing loss. He also had arthritis in his joints. By all accounts, he should not have survived. And yet, he did for years. Why? Because his people didn't abandon him. They adapted with him. This single skeleton challenges everything we thought we knew about prehistoric life. Compassion, it seems, is older than civilization. But it wasn't just physical care. There is growing evidence that Neanderthals may have understood the medicinal properties of plants. Residue found on teeth includes traces of yarrow and chamomile, both known for anti-inflammatory or pain-relieving effects. These are not plants with much nutritional value. Their presence suggests something more intentional: treatment, knowledge passed down, wisdom gathered from observation of animals, of the land, of what heals and what harms. In a world of stone and snow, the Neanderthals found medicine not in a bottle, but in bark, roots, and the breath of community. They likely used moss to dress wounds, charcoal to fight infection, tree resin to bind injuries. Their version of medicine wasn't sterile, but it was functional. It was born of necessity and refined by survival. Even their burials reflect this ethos. Some individuals with deformities were buried with care in positions, suggesting reverence, even protection. These were not burdens to the tribe. They were remembered, respected, loved. What does this tell us? It tells us that healing was not just biological, it was social. To recover, one needed others. And Neanderthals built lives where no one was truly alone. This level of caregiving would have required planning, cooperation, and the ability to see the future. To believe that the wounded could return not to full strength perhaps, but to life, to meaning. We often speak of intelligence in terms of tools and fire. But what greater intelligence is there than the ability to nurture? To tend a wound when resources are scarce? To risk your own safety for the good of the tribe? Modern humans have doctors. Neanderthals had each other. Their medicine may not have been written down, but it lived in their hands, in their choices, in their bones. And those bones, even now, continue to speak. They speak of resilience, of community, of the first flickers of a truth we still hold dear. To heal is to be human. In the frozen plains of the Ice Age, there were no supermarkets, no agriculture, no backup plans. Survival depended on one thing: the hunt. For the Neanderthals, eating wasn't just an act, it was a daily battle, a test of muscle, mind, and memory. One misstep, and the prey escaped. One miscalculation, and the hunter became the hunted. Yet despite the odds, Neanderthals fed themselves and they fed each other. Not just occasionally, but reliably. For over 300,000 years. So how did they do it? They hunted with purpose. This wasn't the random chasing of beasts through the snow. This was strategy, a kind that rivaled even modern hunting practices. They studied migration patterns. They tracked herd movements. They understood terrain, bottlenecks, choke points. They used their knowledge of the land like a map written in footprints and wind. Their primary prey included Ice Age giants, woolly mammoths, reindeer, steppe bison, and wild horses. Taking down such animals required more than a sharp spear. It demanded cooperation. Neanderthals hunted in groups highly coordinated, silent, and lethal. They likely surrounded their prey, driving it into traps or ambush points. At sites like La Côte de Saint-Brelade, evidence suggests Neanderthals drove herds off cliffs using the terrain as a weapon. Elsewhere, butchered remains of entire mammoths tell of collective processing, one animal feeding dozens of people. And they didn't waste. Bones were cracked for marrow. Skins were likely used for warmth. Sinew may have been turned into cordage or hafting materials. Every part mattered. But meat wasn't their only food source. The Neanderthal diet was surprisingly diverse. They gathered berries, nuts, tubers, and even seaweed and shellfish in coastal areas. Residue found on Neanderthal teeth shows evidence of cooked starches, possibly processed from roots or wild grains. This challenges the old stereotype of Neanderthals as purely carnivorous brutes. They were, in truth, opportunistic omnivores, deeply attuned to the rhythm of the seasons and the offerings of their landscape. They understood food as both energy and medicine. Some plant traces suggest medicinal chewing yarrow, for example, known for digestive relief and pain reduction. Whether through trial and error or generational knowledge, they built an understanding of what nourished and what poisoned. What's perhaps most remarkable is how they shared. Hunting wasn't a solitary reward. Meat was distributed within groups, evidence of cooperative behavior, social trust, and perhaps even early ritual. Elders, children, the injured, they all received sustenance. Not out of charity, but as a reflection of the social fabric Neanderthals wove between themselves. Their tools supported their tactics, from sharpened flint spear points to scrapers and bone awls. Neanderthal toolkits were not primitive, they were precise. These weren't single-use implements. They were maintained, sharpened, passed down. Some even show signs of hafting, attaching stone tips to wooden shafts with natural adhesives. This required not just materials, but planning and patience. In short, Neanderthals were not wild scavengers. They were apex predators, thoughtful, skilled, and efficient. To feed one's tribe in the Ice Age was no small feat. It took vision, courage, and community. And the fact that they did it successfully for so long speaks volumes about their intelligence and cohesion. Their diet was more than calories. It was connection to the land, to each other, to the very heartbeat of their time. In every cracked bone and buried fire pit, we see the same truth. The Neanderthal hunt was not only about killing, it was about living together deliberately and with astonishing skill. By 30,000 years ago, the Neanderthals, who had thrived across Europe and parts of Asia for over 300,000 years, began to vanish from the archaeological record. Slowly, quietly, one region at a time. It wasn't a sudden extinction, no catastrophic meteor, no violent collapse, just a gradual fading, as if their fires burned low and never rekindled. So what happened? The answer has long eluded science, and even today, it remains one of prehistory's most haunting questions. But the theories are growing sharper, more nuanced, more human. For decades, it was fashionable to blame climate. The last great glacial period, the so-called last ice age, brought with it severe swings in temperature, altered ecosystems, and shifting animal populations. Game grew scarcer. Migration routes changed. Shelters froze. The world they had mastered for hundreds of millennia had turned against them. But Neanderthals had survived harsh climate shifts before. They were, after all, Ice Age survivors born in cold, hardened by it. So perhaps climate was only one piece of the puzzle. Another theory suggests competition. Around 45,000 years ago, a new species began to arrive in Europe, Homo sapiens. Our species, anatomically modern humans, fresh from Africa, armed not just with tools but with symbolic thought, faster adaptation, and perhaps superior social networks. Wherever modern humans appeared, Neanderthals began to recede. Were they pushed out? Outcompeted? Outnumbered? Maybe. But there's another possibility, one that rewrites the story entirely. What if Neanderthals didn't disappear? What if they became us? In recent decades, genetic studies have revolutionized our understanding of what it means to be human. By sequencing Neanderthal genomes from fossilized remains, scientists discovered something extraordinary. Neanderthal DNA still exists in us. Today, if you are of non-African descent, roughly 1–2% of your DNA likely comes from Neanderthals. These aren't isolated genetic quirks. They influence immune responses, metabolism, even aspects of mood and skin tone. This means that Neanderthals didn't simply die off. They merged. They met Homo sapiens not just in battle, but in intimacy. They interbred. They raised hybrid children. They shared stories, fire, laughter, and blood. In caves once thought to belong to one species or the other, We now find overlapping tool cultures, burial styles blur, genetic fingerprints blend. So maybe their disappearance wasn't a vanishing, but a transformation, a quiet folding into a larger human family. And that changes everything. It changes how we see the past and how we see ourselves. Because the Neanderthal isn't just a fossil in a museum. He may be a part of your ancestry, a shadow in your genome, a whisper in your blood. And perhaps the greatest irony is this. We spent centuries mocking Neanderthals as less than human, when in fact they are part of what makes us human. Their story didn't end 30,000 years ago. It continues in every heartbeat that carries their code, in every breath drawn by a descendant unaware of the ancient legacy within. Not gone, just changed. For a long time, the Neanderthals were remembered only in caricature, hunched silhouettes with clubs and grunts, stumbling through a cold and brutal world. They were cast as the evolutionary other, a failed side branch, a primitive footnote in our rise to greatness. But science tells a different story now, a deeper one etched not in myth or guesswork, but in the very code of our bodies. Because the Neanderthals never truly left. Their DNA lives on in us. Today, nearly every person of non-African descent carries fragments of the Neanderthal genome, not just in abstract genetics, but in our immunity, our hair texture, our skin's reaction to sunlight, even our psychological tendencies. They left their signature not in monuments, but in us. And genes are only part of it. Their tools crafted with precision and passed across generations laid foundations for the technological ingenuity that defines our species. Their mastery of fire, shelter, and hunting strategies helped blaze a trail through the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Their burial practices suggest ritual. Their pigments and cave art whisper of symbolic thought. What does this mean? It means the Neanderthals weren't evolutionary failures. They were pioneers, harsh world engineers, Stone Age philosophers, mothers, fathers, healers, hunters, and yes, teachers. Because what is legacy if not the passing of knowledge across time, across firelight and bloodlines, across memory, spoken or unspoken? Their resilience in the face of hardship still teaches us something today. In a world constantly changing, they adapted. When food was scarce, they innovated. When one of their own was hurt, they cared. Their survival wasn't just a matter of strength, it was a triumph of community. This is perhaps their greatest gift to us. The reminder that the human spirit was never built in isolation. It was built in tribes, in shared burdens, in silent cooperation under mammoth skies. We inherited their bones, yes, but also their instincts, their grit, their empathy. And though they left no great temples, their lives were a kind of architecture, the architecture of endurance. When we look into the deep past, we often do so with the arrogance of modernity. We ask, what did they lack? But maybe we should be asking, what have we lost? In an age of technology and disconnection, the Neanderthal reminds us of what once mattered and what still should. Kinship, resilience, presence, the fire shared, not owned, the wisdom passed, not hoarded. They were not just a step on our evolutionary path. They were part of it inseparably, undeniably. They were not shadows in our past. They are embers in our present. And if you listen closely, you can still hear them in the crackle of fire, in the hush of winter wind, in the quiet strength of those who endure. The Neanderthals may be gone from the earth, but not from our story. They live in us. They always have. We often think of the Neanderthals as ancient, as extinct, as other. But the closer we look, the more they seem like us. And perhaps, the more they remind us of what we once were and what we may have forgotten. Because the Neanderthals, for all their physical might, did not survive on strength alone. They survived and thrived through resilience, cooperation, and care. In a world colder than we can imagine, they found warmth in one another. They didn't abandon their sick. They didn't leave the weak behind. They didn't turn on each other in scarcity. They pulled closer. This wasn't charity. It was survival strategy. A recognition etched in bone and behavior that a tribe is only as strong as its most vulnerable member. That endurance is a collective act. When one of them was injured, the group stepped in. When food was scarce, it was shared. And when death came, as it often did, they buried their dead with reverence. Flowers, tools, perhaps even prayers. What does this say about them? It says they had memory, ritual, a sense of the sacred, and above all, an unspoken understanding that every life mattered not for what it could produce, but for what it meant to the whole. These aren't just interesting facts for anthropologists. They are lessons. Lessons we can apply even now in a world far more comfortable, but no less complex. Lesson 1. Resilience is a mindset, not a muscle. The Neanderthals faced unrelenting winters, shifting landscapes, and the arrival of a new human species. Yet they adapted. They moved. They endured, not through brute force, but through flexibility and grit. Lesson 2. Community is survival. They weren't lone wolves. They were packs, families, networks of mutual dependence. They show us that in a crisis, the instinct to bond is just as powerful as the instinct to flee. Lesson 3. Compassion is intelligence. To care, truly care, is not weakness. It is one of the deepest forms of wisdom. To hold a wounded comrade close, to nourish the old, to comfort the dying, these are not primitive acts. They are timeless virtues. And in the end, maybe that's what we most need to remember. That evolution is not just about faster brains or sharper tools. It's about learning to live with others, to grow not just as individuals, but as communities, as tribes of meaning, bound by more than blood, by choice, by memory, by purpose. We often say that modern life isolates us, that we've lost something ancient and essential. Perhaps what we've lost is what they lived every day, a life where survival required presence, where every face around the fire meant something, where the past was remembered and the future was shared. The Neanderthals are gone, but they are not irrelevant. They're still teaching us. They teach us that strength without compassion is hollow, that intelligence without empathy is cold, that life, no matter how short or harsh, finds meaning in connection. So, what is the greatest lesson they leave behind? That true strength is not the absence of struggle. It's the ability to endure it. Together. At Prehistoric Shadows, we don't treat the past as dust-covered timelines or forgotten ruins. We see it as alive, as something that breathes through the stones, whispers in our DNA, and pulses quietly beneath the surface of modern life. The Neanderthals are not just a side note in humanity's story. They are part of its foundation. They remind us of the courage it takes to face the unknown, of what it means to build a life not with luxury, but with instinct, community, and grit. They endured the unthinkable, and in doing so, they left behind more than fossils. They left behind lessons. This channel is for those who know that the ancient world still matters. That truth doesn't only lie in the future, but also behind us, buried in the shadows of forgotten caves and long-extinct fires. If you've ever wondered what it really meant to be human before civilization, you're in the right place. We explore more than just bones and dates. We uncover meaning. We seek the soul of prehistory. If this story stirred something in you, wonder, awe, even a sense of quiet recognition, don't let it fade. Hit that subscribe button. There's so much more waiting beneath the surface. Because some shadows aren't cast by trees. They're cast by time itself. Welcome to Prehistoric Shadows.